Hi, everybody. So today we're going to talk about the Verizon outage. I don't know why, though, because according to Verizon, this was a software issue, and we are conducting a full review of what happened. As of now, there is no indication this was a cybersecurity issue.
Well, we all know if it's not a ransomware attack, it's not interesting.
So let's remind everybody what happened, of course. Recently, Verizon was down for, it's a little hard to tell how many hours. It was at least 8 hours.
Most of the day, let's say.
Most of a business
Most of a
day, for
business day,
sure.
yeah.
There were some people that even were still having service disruptions the next day.
Yeah.
But I want to remind Verizon the definition of a security incident is, according to NIST, an occurrence that actually or imminently jeopardizes the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of information or an information system. So yes, an outage is actually something that impacts availability and therefore counts as a security incident. And that is why we are talking about it today.
Yeah, you don't have to be hacked for it to be a security incident.
Exactly. The other thing I thought was really interesting is this. What did you think was interesting about this map?
You know, it basically just looks like a population center map of the United States, and it showcases really kind of how widespread the impact of this actually was. I mean, the East Coast is like covered
Right.
with service outages.
But so is the West Coast.
Mhm.
There's all these spots. Also, if it's a population map, I want to remind you there's no one in Montana on this map.
Well, we had people in
And
the
we are
office that
in
actually,
Montana.
we had people in the office who were suffering from this.
That's
so, yeah,
true
it's there.
too. But the bottom line, this is really widespread. This outage was all over the United States, which I think really threw people from a loop and makes it hard to plan for. And this is very different than, for example, when we had the Colonial Pipeline outage,
Mhm.
like a physical oil or gas pipeline, that affected the eastern seaboard. And you could see on the map, there was one specific area. And I think that just goes to show us the risk of supplier related incidents in the modern world,
Yeah.
which is that one little software glitch can affect people all over. And it's not clear exactly how these people are related because Verizon's a black box.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah. So, what are your thoughts?
I mean, so large scale outages like this have happened before. Not just with Verizon, although Verizon did have a similar outage a few months ago.
Yeah.
But when we see something like this happen, it really does kind of put a spotlight on the risk that we take by having these giant pieces of infrastructure like the cellular network or something like Amazon, as an example, which we'll talk about here later, that we all like rely on as a nationwide service. And if there is something like a software update which can impact service for millions of customers simultaneously, I mean, it really brings up the question, we rely on these services, what do we do to get around our reliance on something like a Verizon network or AT&T's network or something
Can we
like that?
talk about some of the impacts? Because it
Yeah.
wasn't just like, la, 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 I can't surf the internet. I mean,
Yeah.
for you, like, what did you see some of the impacts be?
So we saw significant impacts, and this relates back to other outages that we've seen. If you're like most people don't, I think, have a landline anymore. Most people rely on cell service for their telecommunications. That's phone, text, internet communication,
Yeah.
email, like everything else. You may not have an at-home internet service provider. You may rely on mobile data for all of that stuff. And so if your mobile device or your mobile network goes down, you lose that communication platform. You can't call friends and family. You can't call 911.
Well,
Like,
that was
yeah.
a big issue. In fact, I think it was New York even put out a notification about impacts on 911
Yeah.
services. I used to work at a hospital, and I remember way back in the day, this was 20 years ago, we were shifting from landlines to voice over IP. And people were very fearful about that. And one of my jobs as someone on the security team was to assess the security of the new voice over IP platform. And so I got to interview people, and they started telling me what they used phones for. Things like just-in-time ordering of heart transplants,
Mhm.
stuff like that. That really is life or death. And if there was a cell service disruption that delayed some procedure or some patient from getting to where they needed to be, it might not be no one's calling the media. There's no headlines about this. It's really hard to track
Yeah.
the true impacts of an outage that is this widespread.
Well, benefit that we have now is that we have social media, and people
True.
do not hesitate to go on and complain on social media. So looking at the
But
X
not if they
feed, looking
can't
at
get on
Facebook,
social
not if they can't
media
get on,
because their cell service is down.
but that has been a good barometer for kind of how people felt about this outage, because there were a lot of people who popped online to express their dissatisfaction. And you mentioned the notifications from like New York City as an example.
Yes.
We have the one that Notify
Oh, yeah.
NYC put out there, and what they basically told people was this may affect users trying to call 911. So call from a device using another carrier, a landline, or go physically to a police or fire station if you need assistance. If you're in an emergency and the only communication you have is your cell phone, you may not have any of those options available. Like you may not be able to just use another provider or use another
Right.
communication method. So that becomes dangerous for people.
Well, and it shows you why diversification is important. Like if I live in an apartment building, I hope some of my friends have AT&T or
Yeah.
T-Mobile or Sprint, even though I've probably spent years convincing them that Verizon is better and they should convert.
Hasn't worked on me.
Or Apple, for example.
Yep.
Uh, but yeah, and it's often easier as a corporation or a large organization if you're procuring service to say, hey, everybody's going to get service through Verizon or
Hmm.
everybody's going to get service through AT&T. We get bulk discounts. It's easier to manage. But at the same time, it can make us less resilient.
Yeah.
So think about whether you do want to diversify your providers. I know when we're creating data centers, for example, you might want to pipe in connectivity from 2 different providers, and that's just what we're going to do
Oh,
because it's important.
Yeah, that's the norm at this point. Have a dedicated failover, so if your primary service goes down, you automatically switch to another working service.
Right. But in these days of the disappearing perimeter and BYOD and everything like that, our data centers or that capability in some cases is spread everywhere.
Right.
And so, how do we diversify our suppliers in that case and
Yeah.
reduce the risk of systemic threats?
Well, and it becomes tough too, because when we look at telecommunications providers, especially when we look at Charter or Spectrum or any of the other nationwide providers, I mean, they make a really big deal about bundling all of your services through them.
Right.
Get your voice, get your internet, get everything through this one provider because it will supposedly save you money and it's an easier system to manage. And I understand the attraction behind that, but that again means, and it's the same when we talk about like cloud service providers, it gets you into that concentration mindset where everything goes through one single choke point. And if something goes wrong there, if
Yeah.
that service provider goes down, you lose access to all of those services. So,
The problem is it's expensive having backups.
Yeah.
So we really need, as an organization, you need to look at your setup and think about how can we set up a resilient system without double paying for things. And that's where sometimes diversification is a mantra we might want to adopt.
yeah, I mean, in previous IT jobs that I've worked, when we've set up things like data centers or redundant communication points, there's always that question that comes down usually from, upper management or, the bean counters about why we need something like that. Because, I mean, we could have a failover internet service provider for a data center and you could go years without ever needing to use that service. But one day you might need to. And if you don't have it, you're dead in the water. So that becomes the argument that you have to kind of have internally when we talk about whether or not there is enough of a risk to losing connection that you need to have that in place. And for a lot of people, the answer is probably yes. You should have something.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
and this was a fairly long outage, but what if it was a full 24 hours?
Sure.
What if it was 48 hours? At that point, we really have some impacts on day-to-day functionality
Mhm.
and even in some cases, again, hospitals, potentially life and death. Another impact that came up was that patients were not able to receive text messages. Gig workers were
Yeah.
not able to see, they weren't able to work. They weren't able to see where they could go. They weren't necessarily able to like pick people up in their Ubers, things like that.
Yeah, that relies on
So
cell connection.
absolutely. Yeah. There were portions of the economy that really did grind to a standstill, both figuratively and literally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Couple other things popped up. Forrester Research, I really like the stuff they put out. They actually provided an estimate of the impact. They're estimating that Verizon will see as much as $1.5 billion in impact, considering the outage duration and subscriber volume populations. I mean, this impacted millions of people.
Yeah, it did.
It even impacted our pen testers. Tom Poehler, head of pen test, put out a little video. I was talking to him and he was trying to reach our pen test team. They were on site in California. They were literally breaking into a facility physically to plant a wireless device and trying to coordinate with each other. And all of a sudden, nobody could reach them and they couldn't reach each other.
Yeah, that was pretty rough.
Yeah.
Well, luckily, they were successful in getting in. They got
They
the wireless
were.
device put
They
in, and
were.
that's how they
And
were able to communicate. But
when
yeah,
they're successful, they have a longer report to write. So
yeah,
there's that. But I mean, it impacted so much, so many things in everyday life that it's going to be a while, I think, before we fully understand the repercussions.
yeah, I
And
think
we
so.
will never understand the full repercussions.
Yeah.
So I know this has reminded you of, well, both of us, of some prior incidents.
Yeah, there's a couple of them that really kind of echo what happened with Verizon. One of them is AT&T. The AT&T outage that happened, I believe it was last year, like beginning of the year.
Yes.
Very, very similar. So in the case of AT&T, that wasn't a software problem. That was a hardware misconfiguration,
Oh,
which
interesting.
was at that point in time, it was, it seemed on the surface to be a relatively simple misconfiguration, something like, an update to a switch or something like that. But that was the same kind of thing. And in fact, in that case, they had, I think it was 92 million dropped calls or something like that during
Wow.
the duration of the outage. Data services didn't work. That one did affect me, like sitting in my office here at LMG. I mean, I lost my
Maybe you
cell
should
connectivity
switch to
services.
Verizon.
Yeah, that would have been a great idea. But no, I didn't, and I'm happy I didn't. But regardless, the point was that that showcased some of the same kinds of problems. We lost a big chunk of our telecommunication infrastructure, and while like I'm lucky enough that I have built-in failovers that I can use, like I can call through Zoom or I can call through Teams. I have other ways that I can communicate. It affected a lot of people in exactly the same ways, and a lot of that came down to, again, emergency services. The reliance on that simple, one-to-one communication if there is a problem and you need to call 911.
The other big way we've seen people impacted by these telco outages is multi-factor
Oh,
authentication.
yeah, that's a rough
For
one.
people who are using text message as their secondary method of MFA, and a lot of people do this for their bank accounts, for example,
You have to with
if
some
those
banks.
text messages can't get through, you're kind of dead in the
Yeah.
water at that point. It's not like you can call.
Or if you're trying to buy concert tickets or go to a hockey game or something like that,
All the
like
important stuff.
that actually, it sounds silly that I say that, but that did come up in a lot of the
I know.
conversations.
I
Like
did see the hockey
yeah,
tickets
the New York
thing.
Rangers were saying you have to physically print your tickets. Don't rely on your cell phone
Oh,
for
that's
it.
right. I forgot about
Yeah.
that. But when it comes to MFA, I mean, we've been saying for years to move away from SMS anyway. And this is yet another example of why we should
Yeah.
not be relying on SMS authentication. Also, don't use SMS as backup authentication because it's easier for attackers to bypass than other methods.
Mhm.
But the authentication piece, again, that in and of itself makes this a security related issue.
Yeah. Well, the good news, though, is if you were impacted by the Verizon outage, Verizon is giving you $20.
$20.
$20. Don't spend it all in one place, kids.
Sweet. I can get
Yeah.
online to get it now?
You can get online to get it. Or you may just end up getting a bunch of phishing emails that say you're entitled to $20 from Verizon, which we've already
That
seen
always
propagating at this point.
happens.
Yeah.
That always happens.
Yeah. So just a warning to everyone: if you are a Verizon customer, or there is a thought that you're potentially
And
impacted
you
by
get a
this,
text
and
that
you get a
says claim
text,
your $20. Don't.
yeah, watch out for
You
it.
can access it in your app if you do get it. But that reminded us of
CrowdStrike.
CrowdStrike.
Yep.
What did you get from CrowdStrike,
I got
Matt?
a $10 Uber Eats gift card from CrowdStrike for the extra work we put in to help people recover from CrowdStrike.
Wow.
Yeah.
I was actually stuck in Boston for 2 extra days because of
Oh,
CrowdStrike.
poor you.
I saw one person write in, comment on a news post and said, I disconnected today and I actually made some friends I wouldn't have made. And I was like, well, that's
Oh, that's a
nice.
good
I
silver
guess
lining
there's
to
some
it.
like positive
Yeah, there you go.
effects. And in Boston, I did enjoy 2 extra days in Boston, although it was a real pain in the neck.
Yeah, well, yeah, you guys made it back eventually, but yeah, I mean, this is it seems for Verizon, for the number of people that were impacted, $20 a head for the people. So you have to go into the My Verizon app and claim the credit. It goes onto your bill. And AT&T did something similar, and I think like 25% of the people that were eligible for it actually claimed it.
It's interesting
Yeah.
that this doesn't seem to work. I saw a news poll asking people how satisfied they were with their $20 Verizon credit, and 79% of people were like not satisfied.
Yeah.
And it's very common with data breaches, for example. You might see free credit monitoring, or nowadays it's free dark web scanning,
Dark
which
web
is
scanning.
just silly in a
Yeah.
lot of ways. And these are forms of image repair. If you study image repair at all, one of the methods is compensation. And so they're trying to make you feel better by saying, hey, here's something we really care. The problem is, I think when it's something small, it can actually offend people. And I think that's what we're seeing, where with CrowdStrike, they're trying to make it better by giving you something. And I think if it was something maybe thoughtful or personalized, that might have worked. but instead it's something that feels so cheap considering the amount of heartache and headache that occurred.
Yeah.
And with, Verizon, a lot of people were not just inconvenienced, but out of work for a day or things like that. And so to give them $20, I think makes them feel like you don't understand what they went through.
Yeah, well, Verizon said that the $20 should, based on what an average per day cell phone cost is through Verizon's normal service plans. They said that should cover multiple days of service, but at the same time, I mean, it takes 1 to 2 bill cycles to even show up in your account. So a couple months from now, you'll get a
Yeah.
$20 credit. It just seemed. Don't get me wrong. It's a good step for them, but like it really just kind of made a lot of people like roll their eyes
I
when
mean,
it
if
came
they
out.
had sent out an e-card with like kittens on it that moved and said, "We're sorry," I feel like they would have gotten a way better response.
Probably, yeah.
I think, though, as an industry, I think we need to start reconsidering our responses and how we repair relationships in the event of a service outage.
Sure.
And it's part of incident response. With data breaches, when you lose someone's confidential information, maybe a $20 gift card will suffice because it's hard for people to understand the harm.
Yeah.
But when it's an outage, people experience that very viscerally. And you're essentially saying to them, the value of your suffering is $10 or $20. And I'm not sure that really flows.
Not really.
So we'll see how this evolves. There will be more outages, and it'll be interesting to see how the compensation evolves over time, because I think we're just beginning on this one.
Yeah, absolutely. All
Any
right.
other thoughts?
No, at the risk of talking too much trash about Verizon, I think that covers pretty much everything.
We had some questions. We will move into proper Q&A with you guys in a couple minutes, but we actually had some questions ahead of time. Thank you guys so much for writing in advance. There were a couple of really good ones. Let's see. Let's see. I know this is more business oriented, but are there any suggestions you could make for consumers to be more resilient against this kind of concentration of service providers? And I think the same goes for businesses
Yeah.
and for consumers, which is to diversify.
Yep.
I know it's often saves money and it's less effort to all be on a family plan or to all bundle. But either keep a burner phone on another provider or consider having different members of your family and friends with different providers. What are your thoughts?
You kind of hit it right on the head there. I mean, think about it like you would like a power outage kit or something like that. Like, if there's a power outage, you keep extra batteries, you keep candles, you keep things that will, get you through while you wait for the service to come back online. And communications providers are very similar to that. So like myself personally, my internet provider and my mobile data provider are two different companies. That way, ideally, they both don't go down at the same time. But if one goes down, I have the other to fall back onto. And that's my like kind of built-in failover at that point. Honestly, when I did the math on it, without bundling through either one of those providers, I actually saved money by using the two as independent. So don't fall for the bundle gimmick. That oftentimes is not actually a savings, and it puts you at some additional risk there. But yeah, again, just think about it like you would from a corporate standpoint. Like have that failover option in place. It's really not that difficult to do, and there are tons of providers out there that provide each of these services that you can hook up with, get deals on, and they all offer really nice service for the most part.
Yeah, it's interesting. We often see diversification both in people's personal lives and in the business context, just because it evolved organically. People have not gotten organized, and so they use different providers. And then often when people get organized, again, whether it's a company or personally at home, you make deliberate decisions to reduce your number of providers and therefore concentrate your risk. And I think we're moving to a time when we may want purposeful diversification. So maybe that's something to think about in 2026. Purposeful diversification, because that can reduce your risk of systemic outages.
One of the other questions that I really liked here was number 2 here. How can one component of a nationwide telecom cause a nationwide outage? And I know this one came from Eldon, so thank you, Eldon.
Someone dropped the ball.
Someone dropped the ball.
I like that.
I love that phrase there. And the simple answer there is the communication infrastructure that we use is massively interconnected. So the fact that
look at the power system.
Yeah, the power system is a great example of that. And the fact that a software update could cause a nationwide outage just shows that interconnection. Everything is linked together at this point. And I guess the resilience of those networks is tested in instances like this, where we see a mass outage. Now, remember, with the Verizon outage, same with the AT&T outage, it didn't affect every single person that was using the system.
That was the
interesting part.
Yeah.
It was, there were some high concentrations on the East Coast, but we saw this as a nationwide problem. Although, as I mentioned before, here in the office, we have multiple people who are on Verizon, and some felt the heat from that, and others, their service worked just fine.
Yeah.
And there was no real rhyme or reason as to why that was, or at least Verizon hasn't come out and said that specifically. No, it showcases like what a test of that system might actually look like, as opposed to like in August when Verizon had a similar issue. They had a software issue that caused outages on phones, same kind of thing. SOS mode, they couldn't make phone calls, couldn't get data, but that only affected people who were using eSIMs in their phones. So people
Right.
who had physical SIM cards,
Limited.
yeah, it was limited. That doesn't seem to be the case here, but yeah, again, it's interesting to see like what those systems actually do, how they respond when there is this level of outage.
Yep, absolutely. I also, when you said someone dropped the ball, that actually reminded me so much of Equifax.
Oh, God.
So Equifax got hacked because they had one server with one vulnerability. And as a result of that, over 145 million Americans had their social security numbers exposed.
Yeah,
And that is huge.
didn't their CEO blame like one
That's
person?
their CEO was like, well, this one dude forgot to patch. And of course, the reality is it's never one person, it's a system.
Yeah.
And if it comes down to one person, the system has really not been built correctly, unfortunately. I really wish that we had more visibility into critical providers like this. Frankly, I think we should have
Mhm.
more visibility and that there should be some audits and some public facing reports. But this really goes to show how much of a black box Verizon, AT&T, and all these other critical providers are these days.
Yeah. Loretta threw into the chat, it seemed to affect iPhone users more than Android.
Because we're cooler and therefore
Uh,
more targeted.
Most of our employees with iPhone showed SOS. I was able to make calls on my Android. Yeah, I was, Loretta, I was reading about that
Fine,
on,
by the way.
I was reading about that on Reddit. This entire giant argument broke out between Android and iPhone users about how superior Androids were.
Maybe
And
Android
yeah,
users tend to use AT&T.
yeah. So Verizon hasn't attributed any of that as, official news or anything, but it is interesting to look at the actual sentiment. And yeah, Loretta, I agree with you. I saw that same thing. Android users seem to be a lot less affected by this. Not completely unaffected, but less affected.
Yeah. Another question we got was how can we measure these risks as part of a TPRM program? And again, this comes down to the fact that providers like Verizon and AT&T are so big that they really are black boxes right now.
Mhm.
There have been rumblings of that congressional investigation, so we may get some more information. But until software providers and service providers become more regulated and we get more transparency, it's hard to evaluate risk. When it comes to providers that large. Now, your local ISPs or regional ISPs, you may have some more visibility into. And I think the bottom line right now is diversify.
Yeah. Yeah.
Should we go into our key takeaways?
I do want to address the last question that we had here. Am I paying too much for my mobile phone service?
Yes.
Yes, the answer is probably yes. So just
Definitely yes.
keep that one in mind.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, let's go into the takeaways.
Okay, and we'll do more Q&A after we totally wrap up too. So, so takeaways for those of you who work in enterprises, corporations, organizations. I'm going to add one to our list, Matt. We made a list ahead of time, but I think number one needs to be diversify your infrastructure, diversify your suppliers, because ultimately that's going to help us weather these storms. There's going to be more outages, and let's just make sure we have a fallback plan that's actually integrated into your day-to-day operations.
Mm-hmm. Next thing is you want to make sure you treat outages as security incidents because realistically, they are security incidents. This is not just a reliability problem because for the most part, I mean, if you look at a year-to-year basis with most providers, including the ones that have had big outages in the news lately, their uptime's like 99.9%. So they're usually functional.
Usually.
But this can cause a problem for you. So there needs to be something in place to deal with that, and integrating that into your incident response plan, integrating it into your DR plans, making sure that you have a contingency in place if one of these providers goes down is really essential.
Yep. And that ties in with our next one. Identify and document your dependencies on carriers and cloud providers.
Yeah.
I have seen so many lists of suppliers for organizations, and it is very rare for a company like Verizon or AT&T to be on that list. Often the ones that are so big and so important are kind of not, they're forgotten when we start thinking about who do we rely on. So think about do you rely on cell service for your day-to-day operations? Who provides that cell service? add them to your list of suppliers that you are relying on.
Yeah.
We've seen a lot of attacks on telcos the past couple years. Salt Typhoon being another
That
good
was a huge
example.
one. Yeah.
We're going to talk about that next week a little bit in our top threats webinar. Stay tuned for that. Please join us if you can. And in the meantime, make sure that you're understanding who your suppliers are all the way up to the top.
Yep. Next one, and again, this is something that's been asked for in a lot of the tabletop exercises that we do. But plan and test your IR without access to something like your phones, SMS, or the primary cloud access. If you lose access to Microsoft services, or if your VoIP system goes down, or something like that, how does your organization respond? And this is where we end up seeing a lot of breakdowns happen in response actions based on the lack of communication or formalized out-of-band communication or something like that. So if you're doing a tabletop exercise and you're working on something like network outage, factor that in and just see where in your incident response plan you have documented and disseminated how people actually communicate if those primary systems are offline, because it's not always as straightforward as people think.
I keep going back to a story from one of the banks that I teach with at the Pacific Coast Banking School, one of our students.
Mhm.
And they shared that a few years ago, their internet service provider was hit with ransomware and got taken down. And all of their branches were taken down and all of their phones were taken down. Everything was completely down. And, the first thought is, oh, we'll fall back to paper. Well, we don't have paper. Like they literally just didn't have the forms, didn't have enough pens, all that stuff.
Yeah.
And then how do we get, wire transfers to the right place? They ended up falling back to certain people's personal cell phones in an emergency. That was unplanned. And imagine your bank is doing all of your back end transactions on taking pictures on cell phones. How do you even clean that up?
Yeah.
If that is the fallback plan, maybe plan ahead for that. So, guys, these things happen. They were out for 60 hours.
That's rough.
60. Yeah. So it took a really long time to clean up from that. Okay. Expect outages to increase fraud and social engineering activity. You should take this one, Matt.
Oh, yeah. And we talked about this when we talked about Venezuela. And we see it pop up anytime that there's either a major outage, national disaster, political upheaval, unrest, something like that. It's amazing how quickly attackers will respond to something like this. So,
Oh, yeah.
again, if you get a text message or an email that says, click here to claim your free $20 Verizon credit, don't do it. Go to your Verizon app and do it the way Verizon told you to, because odds are pretty good somebody's trying to phish your account credentials or something else. And if somebody gets your account credentials, that means you are ripe for SIM swapping or some other kind of cybercrime. Again, attackers will automatically take advantage of this, especially since now we have AI in play here. So all I have to do is tell my phishing generation engine to include Verizon as one of the components, and it just spams out those emails to everyone.
What would you do if ChatGPT was down?
Oh, I don't even want to think about that. I'd have to use Gemini.
No.
Gross.
Okay. Use widespread outages as learning opportunities. So, you guys, Verizon was down. This is a great opportunity to have this conversation within our own organization. So, look at your upcoming meetings. Is there an IT meeting, a security meeting, some other meeting, an executive team meeting? Just throw it on there and say, how were we impacted? If this didn't impact us directly, how could we have been impacted?
Right.
Are there ways that we rely on text, or that we text our customers, or we text our vendors, or we call? And think about whether there are things we need to do to diversify. So take advantage of the crisis.
Yeah, I like using that as kind of a thought exercise, because one of the questions that we got here was about other mobile service providers. So Down Detector was showing at the same time Verizon was down some issues with T-Mobile and AT&T happening simultaneously. And there was a question like, was this all related? And I think I kind of scoffed when that question came in, and I was like, they're always having problems. The jaded nature of working in technology. But that is exactly kind of what we're talking about here. As far as we know, these outages from T-Mobile and AT&T, because they were small and isolated, were not actually part of the Verizon outage. But if one of those carriers went down, how would that impact you? So,
well, and if everyone starts rushing to another carrier, does that carrier have capacity? So you have to think about that as well. With that,
well, we have one more question if you want to hit it really quick.
Well, let's move into Q&A.
Cool.
For those of you that want to stick around, we'll take questions for another couple minutes. For everyone else, thanks so much for tuning in. Please like and subscribe. We have our Top Threats webinar next week, and we'll be back on Cyberside Chats next week as well. There will be a lot of us this month.
Yeah.
All right, let's see these last couple live questions that we have.
All right, so this one came in from Ben. He said, you've mentioned the black box nature of large providers like Verizon. Is there anything we can do about getting some more visibility into these massive providers beyond wait for the government to do something about it? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, what we're starting to see right now is a big push towards having vendors sign security addendums or security agreements. And while, one little organization may not be able to make a change, many banded together can actually make a difference.
Mhm.
And some of these, for example, I just wrapped up a template security addendum for LMG's clients, which I'll be giving out to our clients. And it basically gives you the ability, you give it to a vendor, it's an addendum to your normal contracts, and it gives you the ability to audit them once a year, to request information about their security, to see at least a summary of their security reports.
Yeah.
So in that respect, we can start to get visibility through our contractual relationships. And again, one organization alone may not make a difference, but work with your ISACs, work with your local security groups, work with your local ISPs and telecommunications providers. Start there and work your way up. Great question.
Another question came in. It said, which part of incident response and disaster recovery plans most often fail during large-scale multi-provider outages, and why? So I would say communication is usually the first victim when we see these large-scale disruptions of services. And this is something, again, that we hit in our tabletop exercises really frequently. In fact, it's one of the things that even if it's not asked for, I will throw in an inject about communication. Because, when the man, I almost said a swear word there. When the rubber hits the road,
This is not. I don't think there's children watching.
I don't think so anyway. But when it really comes down to it, when you're in the heat of response and you lose access to something like your main communication platform, people scramble and they'll start using anything they possibly can. Because there is that need to stay coordinated. So that's when we start seeing things like unencrypted text messages containing private data about an event, people using personal email accounts for things.
And there's often no cleanup afterwards. Nobody takes the time to say, okay, what personal stuff we're like not going to ignore this. We're going to ignore that it happened.
Yeah.
And that means it never gets cleaned up. That's a really good one.
Yeah, normally that's the big thing that we see.
Another one we see is, I'll just look this information up on the fly, and actually the place you usually look up the contact info is not available.
Yeah.
So it's like a bootstrapping problem. And similarly, this is just from over 20 years of incident response experience. I often see people saying, we'll just fall back to paper. And then they actually go to fall back to paper and they do not have paper, or they do not have enough paper, or they don't have the right form, or they don't have enough pens, or their stash of pens for emergencies doesn't work anymore. So if you are planning on falling back to any kind of physical stuff, make sure you have that stuff available.
Yeah, exactly.
All right.
All right.
Looks like that's a wrap.
Cool.
Thank you guys so much. Great topic, great interaction. Really appreciate you guys. Hope you'll tune in next month and see you soon on Cyberside Chats.
Thanks, everyone.